Well, about 2 weeks ago, I was scrolling through my Kindle library, like my digital library. I was looking for something or other. And as I was looking, this wasn't what I was looking for, but as I was looking, I noticed a pattern that began to emerge in my Kindle library. And see if you can spot it. And I think there might even be a picture coming up, a screenshot of my library. This is what I started to notice. I had books with titles such as The Disappearing Church, That Was the Church That Was, Losing My Religion, How the West Really Lost God, The Benedict Option, A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian Society, How to Survive the Zombie Apocalypse and the Death of Christian Britain, and so on. This striking theme came at me. I think you can see the common thread. And what's more, most of the books I just quoted, except for one, were written in the last 5 years. This is something. Now, why are those books there? Partly they reflect a particular obsession of mine that might give you some context. In the recent years, I've done some research in Australian church history, and in that I discovered, as you often do in research, that the picture I had is more complicated than I had anticipated, especially in the nature of the religious and secular history of Australia. I had a story that I carried in my head, and perhaps it's in yours as well, that the West or Western culture has had a long, slow advance of secularization, kind of like a cancer that spread from about the Enlightenment or maybe a bit before or maybe a bit after, and has just kind of been slowly knocking down all before it, and we've become more and more secular. And then we as Australians in particular, as a product of the Enlightenment, the modern Australia is a product of the Enlightenment, and so we've kind of never been very Christian. That's the story I had in my head, and it turns out that reality is more complicated than my head. In the period that I was studying, I was looking at the period from 1922 to 2002, and it turns out there are 3 quite distinct stages for the fortunes of the gospel in Australia. So 1922 to the end of World War II was a dim time on the whole for the gospel in Australia. Things like church attendance, things like Sunday schools and student work and so on were not strong. The Bible colleges on the whole, well, the theological colleges were not strong. That was not a strong time for things that matter to us. But then you get to the end of World War II, and especially about 1949, right up to 1963, and Australia goes through this period of quite substantial and measurable expansion in a whole lot of things that matter to people in this room, like church attendance, Sunday school, student work, the birth of the Bible college movement, and so on. That was kind of an extraordinarily advantageous time for evangelical Christianity and for the cause of the gospel. I think one of the things we have to do is see that the Billy Graham crusade of 1959 wasn't so much the thing that lit a fire, but was the culmination of a strong decade of evangelism and growth. I think it was a symptom as much as a cause of a strong moment for the gospel in Australia. And then thirdly, from about 1963, in an unusual way, kind of exactly 1963, we saw a decline again in church attendance, in nominal Christianity gets decimated, and the kind of downward trend that we're aware of in some but not all areas began and then continued. And my guess, and though we are probably too close to it to work it out, I remember C.S. Lewis, he never used to read the newspaper, and when he was asked why he didn't read the newspaper, he said, in the 50s, he said, we don't even know what caused World War I yet. Why would the guy who's writing this afternoon understand what happened this morning? Which is always worth bearing in mind when you're listening to cultural commentators. But my guess, and my strong suspicion, is that you and I are living through some sort of next permeation in the story of the gospel in Australia. That something happened in about 2011, 2012, where the culture, the direction, that industry of books about why it's all going south, I think we're living through something here and now. And I think if future historians were trying to understand our moment, they would at least know this, that we had a perception based on our book titles, on our podcasts, on the names of our conferences and so on, that we felt under threat, that we felt like in some way there was a culture of fear and anxiety that needed to be addressed, and our conferences and book titles and podcasts, I think, are testimony to that. And I want to give a kind of minority talk or a minority perspective, slightly unbalanced and possibly unhinged, but I want to give a perspective on one aspect and push back on one aspect of that culture of fear and anxiety, and push back on that tonight. So my talk title is Be Not Afraid, Proclaiming the Gospel in an Age of Fear. And so I want to talk about evangelism, the good news that King Jesus is saving men and women from the judgment of hell through his death and resurrection. I want to think about what it looks like to proclaim that message in this context. And I want to put forward this counterintuitive thesis that evangelistically we're living through a great period. That evangelistically we should expect fruit, that we should preach with confidence, and we should not let the culture of anxiety and fear, which I think is real in relation to the institutions of Western culture, bleed into our expectations for what the gospel will do in the hearts and minds of unbelievers. That's the little thesis I want to argue with you in the short time we've got tonight. I think the context for evangelism in our moment comes out of two main concerns. Firstly, there's the concern of the unique pressure we feel from our culture. And secondly, a perception that we might be dropping the ball evangelistically from within the church. And they're the two concerns. So consider the outside pressure first. As I mentioned, since about 1963, there's been this fairly relentlessly downward trend in a whole bunch of things that matter to us. And then this perceived sense that in the last 3 to 5 to maybe 10 years, there's been some sharp turn again, brilliantly described by the quote that Greg had for us before, that Christians have moved from being goody-goodies that you could tease for being goody-goodies to somehow being a force for evil, or at least a group of people that believe some evil things. And so we face now these kind of legal and political environment that would be hard to imagine even like 10 years ago. The situation we find ourselves in. If I can put it this way, if someone wants to make your life extremely difficult, all they need to do is trawl through your sermon archive, find the last time you spoke on Romans chapter 1 or 1 Corinthians 6, and they can make real trouble for you. That is true and verifiable. That's the situation we live in. If I can give a kind of illustration to say how I understand our moment, it's like this. It is as if Western culture and Australian culture was playing a game of musical chairs, and the music had been left on for a long time, and we're all up there sort of dancing to the same tune, and roughly kind of things were going okay. And then suddenly someone stopped the music and 70% of the population sat down. And then 30% of the population were left standing up, holding a view of marriage and sexuality and morality that was very suddenly in the minority. I think that's a kind of picture of what happened in our moment. And this is where it gets complicated, because of the 30% that were left standing, those of them who were Christian, almost none of them held their view of marriage for specifically Christian reasons. So almost all of those 30% of the people that were left standing held a view of marriage that they had largely inherited from a Christian or Christianized society rather than from specific Christian instructions. That is, it's not the case that when they were converted in, the 1990s, that someone sat down and said, great, you become a Christian. What you need to know is that you need to read your Bible and pray. You're going to go to church and you're going to hold a very strange minority view of marriage that could get you kicked out of your, venues and so on. It just wasn't what they signed up for. It wasn't part of the way they were catechized and discipled, which makes a very tricky situation, because of that 30%, I think a lot of them are standing up sheepishly. Standing up with something that they didn't realize was part of the deal, except that they signed a blank check to Jesus, so it's all part of the deal, but they didn't specifically come in and think, I want to make a stand on this issue. It's just that everyone else sat down. And a view that kind of 5 minutes ago was universal was suddenly this thing. And so I think a lot of that 30% are like looking to us as their leaders and teachers and saying, do we still need to stand up? Is everyone else is sitting down? Is there any way at all possibly that we could just have a little bit of a sit down at this moment? That's my picture of the moment that we've lived through and that we're thinking about tonight. But this is where I want to kind of go slightly off the reservation. That's a discipleship problem. It's not an evangelism problem. See, that moment of those people that are left standing with a view that perhaps they've been undertaught on or didn't realise they were going to have to make a stand on, that's a problem for Christians. It's a problem for discipleship, and it's a challenge that we need to meet, and I think to an impressive degree are meeting. Same-sex attracted Christians like Sam Albury and Ed Shaw and Wes Hill, teachers and preachers like Greg Lee and Dan Patterson have been preaching and teaching into this space in compassionate and intelligent ways. And we need to teach the next generation of Christians and our children that they're living in an environment that hasn't been true in living memory in Australia, where the beliefs that we hold will probably cost them something, and something quite material. But again, I say it's a challenge for discipleship, not an evangelism challenge as such. Or if I can put it this way, it's the maturity pastor's problem, not the mission pastor's problem. See, what I worry about this is that we're pessimistic, and I think with good cause, about the society and the institutions. But we let that pessimism come across to the actual human beings with whom we're called to share the gospel. We had this kind of zero-sum idea that if discipleship suddenly got more difficult, that if the chances of someone in this room doing time in a court or in prison are not zero, if that's our environment, then it's also at the same time necessarily an environment that is evangelistically difficult, and we just need to pull up the drawbridges and sit this one out. And I don't think that follows. I don't think it follows biblically. So you think about a book like 1 Peter or the book of Philippians, which you could not understand apart from believing two things can be true at the same time, that the society can be hard and the gospel can be fruitful. Or think about church history. Do you remember that period in church history where the gospel did go forward and it caused no ripples and it caused no grief for the people who held it? Me neither. It's not true biblically, and it's not true historically. And this is the thing I want to say. I don't think it's true here, now, in our moment either. And I bring to the witness stand for your consideration, amongst other groups I could have chosen, the testimony of the AFES workers across Australia. I talked to a whole number of these guys in the lead up to giving this talk, and I wanted to talk to them because they're the guys that are talking to the 18 to 23-year-olds. They're talking to the people who have been raised in a culture of gender fluidity, of intersectionality and so on. And time again, what the guys on the campuses are saying is that this is the best and freshest evangelistic environment that they've seen in their lifetime. Now, some of that is among mainland Chinese and Persians, and we've been aware of the fruitfulness in that field for a while. But, freak show, oh my goodness, also among Aussies, who are kind of rocking up at the O-Day stalls and coming, this new generation who are so post-Christian and who have been taught a kind of a package deal of ideology, a lot of which is kind of incoherent. And, you know, there's a rule that you should bear in mind, which anything that cannot go on forever won't. And there's a whole lot of the package that just can't go on forever. And they come to the O-Day stalls and come in, and for them, being post-Christian, it's also new and genuinely interesting that they just kind of come in. And if they've got any perception of Christians, it's so outrageously negative that all you need to do is offer them a cup of tea and not punch them, and you look like Mother Teresa. So, are the AFES groups, for example, under legal pressure? Yes. Could one of them get kicked off campus in the next 5 to 10 years? Kind of almost certainly, definitely highly likely. is it a fruitful time for student evangelism? It really is. And we've got to be able to hold those two things together at once. So I see the dark clouds on the horizon, legally and politically and economically. I work with Steve McAlpine. How could I miss the darkness of those clouds? In terms of the institutions, it's real, but I'm concerned that we don't let that bleed into our view of evangelism, because I think there's a freshness and an openness and kind of a ditzy blonde innocence towards the gospel that is precious and that we need to seize. I would go so far as to say, evangelistically, it's the best environment in my lifetime, and possibly for the lifetime of a lot of people in this room. So let's make hay while the sun shines. I want to address the second thing and then then wrap it up. The second thing that we hear, I hear, is the idea that perhaps as Christians, as Christian people, we've kind of dropped the ball, that there's a problem not just outside but also inside. The analysis is that we've dropped the ball on evangelism, that we've become distracted and lost our way. I call it the Chapo effect, and the question is, where are all the Chapos? Where have the Chapos gone? John Chapman, the great evangelist of the previous generation. And it's literally true. It's hard, I think, to point to the successor of Chapo. But that's quite a distinct successor to point to. You're looking for a full-time itinerant evangelist who used the expository method of Bible teaching to bring compelling evangelistic talks that non-Christians would listen to and be converted in the moment in the service. That seems to have gone. There isn't a Chapo who does it that way, and I think the argument sort of goes like this: we've lost our moment and we don't do that stuff anymore. And the reason is that we've become distracted. And the good thing about this is that you can insert your bugbear into whatever the distractions are, whether it's cultural renewal or liturgy or GAFCON or diocesan politics or buying a property or starting a independent denomination, leadership, church safe courses, church planting, and so on. We've become distracted, and then the thing you don't like is the thing that has distracted us. And then along with that narrative, you hear evangelism is hard and it's always been hard and you've just got to make it a priority. And it's like eating your vegetables. None of us like it, but you've just got to do it. Or it's like leg day at the gym. So suck it up, princess, and go for it. And I am open to part of that being true, but I want to give 4 minority reports. Number 1, I think we're living in a golden era of course-based evangelism. Fantastic off-the-shelf tools, Introducing God, Christianity Explored, Life, and courses, churches running their own programs, courses that are faithfully proclaiming the gospel over weeks in friendly contexts in which people seamlessly move from hearing the gospel to being included in the life of the local church, and they get to be discipled by the same people they were converted by. That is brilliant. Who thought of that? That is awesome. It'd be great to get some empirical data, but I suspect that there's much less dropping of the ball as people move seamlessly into the church that first brought them the gospel. Secondly, can I voice my personal objection to the idea that evangelism is inherently hard? I love it. Indeed, this needs, again, to stay between you and me. What happens at FIEC stays at FIEC. I vastly prefer evangelism to a huge list of other things that I do in my job as a minister. I just don't get the leg day thing. There's some aspect of things to do with evangelism I find hard, like cold contact and getting rejected and meeting new people is always hard. But any part of any project is hard. But I'm yet to find the verse that tells me that evangelism is uniquely hard, that it's always leg day and vegetables. And I think I speak for maybe not all of us, but some of us, where actually talking to a non-Christian about Jesus is great. And I actually find myself distracting myself from other things that I don't like about my job to do evangelism, because it's way more fun and way better. Number 3, we're planting churches. The early kind of 2007 to 2012, you could have argued maybe that it was just a fad of church planting. It was a desperate ploy to pull in the latest thing. But if you look at the scene in 2018, it's not a fad. It's become a serious, settled, well-resourced movement of the planting of churches across Australia, driven by evangelism, with people who are in it for the long haul and often going into hard places. That's amazing. And fourthly, and very finally, because I think a bell rang which was telling me to get off, come back with me to the dim, dark days of the 1990s. And think about this. We had some itinerant evangelists, Chapo, Sean Potts, and some others. They were very rare. And there was hardly anyone who was employed by a local church, full or part-time, with the express job description of winning the lost and helping us to win the lost. Now, there were kind of well-meaning appointments of associate pastors where you said, as well as doing all the stuff that pastors have to do, could you please also focus on evangelism? Or sometimes there was, churches that would occasionally employ the odd bod evangelist, that guy who was kind of a bit weird but did a lot of evangelism, and then you'd swamp them with admin, and then 3 years later they were still a bit odd and they couldn't organise their way out of a paper bag, and you kind of wondered whether that was the right thing to do. And the thing is, the dice were loaded from the start, because you were telling someone to do something and then withdrawing from them the power to do it. It's kind of this weird Romans 7 thing where it's kind of cruel to say, hey, do something, and here is a situation in which you could never possibly do it. But fast forward to today, and the adoption of team ministry approaches on staff, like the 5Ms and others, we now have people, more people than maybe ever, who are specifically employed in local churches to do evangelism and to lead us in evangelism, and they're given the space and resources to do it. Gifted people employed specifically for that purpose, and the cards aren't stacked against them doing it. So where are the chapos? I don't think we've got one. And if anyone knows where we can get them, we'll take 6, 12, as many as you can throw at us. But thanklessness is a sin. And I am so thankful for those 4 things that we see in Australia at the moment. I'm thankful for the environment evangelistically, because I think there's a freshness that we need to seize. Evangelism has changed, it's morphed, and no doubt we're dropping the ball in some areas, and the price of theological faithfulness is eternal vigilance, and no doubt we all long for more fruitful days. I pray for days when conversions are rich and plentiful and just like crazy common. But allow me to be provocatively optimistic and seize this moment and say this is not the moment to shrink back, but to go forward with the glorious gospel at a great moment in our culture for reaching the culture with Jesus. Amen.